Good morning to all those of you that take time to join this webinar organized by Agora Energiewende. The title of our webinar today is A Clean Industry Package for the EU, How Industry Could Contribute to a minus 55% climate target by 2030 and achieve climate neutrality by 2050. The webinar is scheduled for 2 hours, so we're just starting and we are expecting to run until 12. Welcome to all of you. Why do we do this webinar? The basic materials industry is a cornerstone of Europe's economic prosperity. It is currently providing around 2 million jobs in Europe, but it is also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And over the past years, those emissions have been stagnating. Now, this has been happening despite efficiency improvements. And the question now is, how can the basic materials industry in Europe become climate neutral by 2050? And how much can it contribute to reaching the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target of at least 55% reductions as proposed by the European Commission? Now, this is the background to today's webinar. We have a very impressive lineup of speakers. We are starting just after my introduction and a bit the technical stuff of this webinar with an impulse by Antoine Colombani from the Timmermans cabinet, followed by Pierre Jérémy, who is an advisor to the Minister Delegate for Economy, Finance and Recovery in France. Then we will open for a round of Q&A to these two impulse statements. And then we are moving to a presentation by my colleague Oliver Sator, who will present a new study that was published a few days ago, why the EU needs a clean industry package and what it must contain. Afterwards, we do have a roundtable discussion with 3 participants, Adolfo Aiello, the Director for Energy and Climate of Eurofair, with Rob van der Meer, Director of EU Public Affairs of Heidelberg Cement, and Judith Curtin-Darling, the Deputy General Secretary of Industry All, one of the main trade union associations in Europe. And then after this roundtable, after a few minutes of the roundtable, we will have again a Q&A with all of you in the audience. Now, to give some help for you out there how to interact with us, there is at the bottom of your screen, you see 2, or should see 2 buttons. One is the so-called chat button. So for any technical issues that you have, like you cannot hear properly, your screen is frozen, questions on where can you find the studies that we're referring to, or the presentation my colleague Oliver Sator will be using, all of this you find in the chat window, and any questions of technical nature, please pose through the chat window. There's a second button on the bottom of your screen, and this is the Q&A button. And this Q&A button, please use for any of the content related questions. So if you want to ask a questions to one of the panelists in this meeting, please use the Q&A button. What will happen is that 2 of my colleagues, Janne Görlach and Vido Viteka, are constantly screening what is coming through the Q&A window, and they will then take out the most pertinent questions, and then Janne will ask those questions, and I will moderate and give it to the panelists. Now, my colleague Vido will also reply to the questions that we cannot pick up during the debate in writing. So all of your questions will be taken up in some form. Now, before we start, I hand over to my colleague Nicola Bock, to start with a poll, because this is very helpful for us and for the panelists to know who is in the meeting, who's following the discussion today. Nicola, over to you.
Thank you, Matthias. Good morning, everyone. Let me start with a poll straight away so we don't lose too much time. You should be able to see it on your screen now, and I'm checking with my control monitor. Yes. If you can't see it, then you're probably only in the Zoom meeting with the browser version, and there, unfortunately, not all features are allowed. So you will have to just watch it. Everyone else, please do vote, and I will read out the questions so the ones who don't see them know what you're voting about. So for question number 1 is, what is your professional background? And actually, you can pick more than one if that's the case. A is industry, B, energy, C, policy government, D, finance, E, science, F, non-government organizations, so NGOs, or G, other. And then question number 2. Do you think that the policy framework for industry decarbonization, as proposed so far under the European Green Deal, is sufficient to drive investments into climate neutral technologies by 2030? And there you have 3 options. A, yes, B, no, or C, I don't know. And I'm going to wait a few more seconds so that everyone has the chance to make up his or her mind. Okay, I think I finish now and make the results visible to everyone. You should be able to see them now on your screen. And we see that we have a 29%, or 34 out of 119 who voted have an energy background, followed by industry and science. 27 persons out of 119 say they're working in industry or science. And then the next one is policy government, 23 persons from 119 who voted. And again, NGOs and other are 19 persons from the 119 who voted. So that's sort of balanced with a majority of people working in energy. Surprise, surprise. And then regarding the second question, a majority, 68 persons answered with a no. So think the policy framework for industry will not drive investment into climate neutral technologies. 9%, 11 persons think yes, that's enough. And then a good number, 34%, which equals 40 persons, have not made up their mind on that yet. And with that, I hand back to you, Matthias.
Thank you, Nicola. That's very interesting as a start, I believe. So we do have a very broad range of participants from all walks of life that do have a stake in Europe's the industry transition to greenhouse gas neutrality and the debate on the 2030 target. And to me personally, the 57% that are currently unclear whether the European framework is up to the task of supporting industry, investing into the green technologies that we need to see, is of course a good starting point to have a rich debate. Now, without further ado, I hand over to our first speaker, giving an impulse to the debate from the European Commission perspective. So more looking from top down, I would say. And I'm very happy to welcome Antoine Colombani, who is a member of the cabinet of Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, who is leading the European Commission's work on climate and the European Green Deal. Antoine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to have this exchange today. of course, our starting point is that if we want to achieve climate neutrality, which is our objective for 2050, it's very clear that some industrial sectors face a bigger challenge than others. They will have to undergo a deeper transformation. And this is, of course, particularly the case of energy-intensive industries. Now, these sectors, within a relatively short time span, have to decarbonize and become more circular. For decarbonization, we think it's essential that the low-carbon technologies that will allow us to get there are demonstrated at scale during this decade, the coming decade, if we want to deliver the increased reductions of GHG emissions that we need after 2030. So this is very much the challenge that we are facing right now. This is not for something to think about in 10 years' time. We also know that the carbon price will not be high enough in the coming decade to produce changes in a spontaneous way. Of course, carbon pricing remains a key pillar to set the right incentives. And as you know, we will adapt the ETS to the new objectives, the 55%, minus 55% GHG reduction objectives for 2030. We will adapt that along with other relevant legislation by June next year. But of course, this will need to be complemented by other policies. The first one I'd like to mention, the first dimension, I would say, is support to low carbon technologies, including breakthrough technologies. And we do this, we try to do this at every stage, I would say, through the EU programs. There is, of course, Horizon Europe and InvestEU. We recently had progress in the discussions on the new multi-annual financial framework. We very much hope for a positive conclusion. And this tool, InvestEU, I think will play a very important role in terms of risk sharing for energy intensive industry. And of course, we have also the Innovation Fund, which is financed from the ETS. And the Innovation Fund is a very important instrument since it will really focus on the highly innovative technologies, and it will allow risk sharing to help with the demonstration stage. So it's really about demonstrating first of a kind highly innovative projects, including, but not exclusively, carbon capture and storage and use. Now, of course, we have in the new package, in terms of the EU budget, we have the recovery plan. We are in a very deep crisis, which is also affecting energy-intensive industries a lot. The recovery plans and the common effort, the joint effort, which is being made at EU level to support recovery in member states can play a role there as well. I think breakthrough technologies could also be supported through that channel. As you know, the Next Generation EU, which is this joint recovery strategy, is very much oriented towards Green Deal objectives since 37% of the recovery and resilience facility, which is the main tool, will have to contribute to climate goals, and all the rest will have to comply with the do no harm principle. Now, we announced as well in our industrial strategy that we would seek to launch an industrial alliance on low carbon industries. The idea is to work together, to put people together and make sure that we have a pipeline of projects large projects to deploy the breakthrough technologies. So we are working on that as well with European industry associations to develop this. And there is also another tool, which is in very bureaucratic terms named Important Projects of Common European Interest. But essentially, this is about pulling possible state aid from member states for innovative projects which are in the EU common interest. So this is a possible tool also that could be used in that area. So this is for the support to technologies. I would add that a key element will be as well to have a favorable regulatory environment. Here I will mention as an example, but it's an important one, everything we're doing on hydrogen, including the clean hydrogen certification framework that we have proposed in our strategy. But also I would say our circular economy action plan, both the sustainable product policy that we want to create, so making sure that products are circular by design, and also a range of actions which stem from the action plan and which cover different sectors. For example, in construction, and this is something that we have recently announced as part of our strategy on building renovation, that we will issue a roadmap for reducing the whole life cycle carbon emissions in buildings. So these are examples of setting a favorable framework, I would say, to decarbonization and circularity. We are also aware that maybe innovative forms of support may be needed, and this is why we're exploring new tools such as contracts for difference, for low carbon and renewable hydrogen. This is something that could be particularly useful. This is something we're looking at in the revision of state aid rules, which are planned next year. This is something potentially that we could do also through the Innovation Fund. Another point is, of course, having the right infrastructure. And again, I think hydrogen is the case in point. We're revising the 10E regulation, so the Trans-European Networks, the part for energy, which will basically define the priority projects. So hydrogen infrastructure and other low carbon infrastructure will be particularly central to this revision. It will be an alignment with the new priorities of the Green Deal. And of course, industries need access to renewables. And if you follow the news later today, in the College of Commissioners today, there is a very ambitious strategy on offshore renewables, which will be adopted. Another point that I want to mention is that in these industries, of course, the EU and the Commission is committed to continue to ensure protection against carbon leakage. This will be important in the coming years. We have said that free allocation will continue in phase 4 of the ETS. In parallel, we are looking at the various options for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that includes, of course, which possible sectors could be included. We have said that we would do it for selected sectors. But we need to be aware that the rest of the world is also moving, or intending to move in the direction of decarbonization. We've had positive announcements recently from China, from Japan, from Korea. And I think this just underlines the need for European industry to transform quickly. We should not miss the opportunity to lead the way here. And this is, of course, something to keep in mind both for industry and for regulators, for public authorities, including the Commission. Now, what we have now is a framework with the Green Deal, with the climate neutrality objective, with the 2030 objective, which we're about to adopt, and the climate law, which will set the framework for the trajectory. But the Green Deal and all of that will be, of course, an evolving thing. We hope that with the objectives and with all the regulatory package we are going to adopt next year, we provide clarity for investors. But this is very much an agenda the Green Deal is a roadmap. It is an agenda that will continue to develop. We've had a lot of strategic documents published over the past year. And you will see, of course, the more concrete actions, the more legislative also output, which will be delivered in the months and the years to come. I just want to mention also to finish that the industrial strategy that the Commission put forward close to the start of its mandate will be updated next year, also by June next year. And I think this is an opportunity to take into account the impacts of the COVID crisis, the context, the global context and competitiveness matters, and also the acceleration, the necessary acceleration of the twin green and digital transitions. So I'm looking forward to the exchange today in this context. And again, don't look at the current policies as the last word from the Commission and the EU. There will be, of course, more to come.
So many thanks, Antoine, for this initial impulse from the European Commission perspective. You mentioned your hope that there is sufficient clarity from an investor perspective, an industry perspective, but probably also the question, is there sufficient clarity yet from a member state perspective, looking at what is being developed by the European Commission. Now, to give this member state perspective, we're happy to welcome to this morning's panel Pierre Jérémy. He is an advisor to the Minister Delegate for Economy, Finance and Recovery in France, and as such also directly involved in the design of the French recovery planning, and which is currently being discussed in the French Parliament. So exactly the right person to give us some insights on how does the emerging landscape of European industrial policy look like from a national perspective, in this case, particularly the French perspective. So Pierre, the floor is yours for an impulse from your side.
Well, thanks very much, Matthias. So I'll develop my talk around two key points, which are, first of all, how do we intend to achieve our collective climate goals and decarbonize our industry? And what role does the recovery plan, France Relance, take in this objective? And secondly, I'd like to say a few words on the updated ambition we set with the minus 55%. So as you know, Europe has already made significant efforts towards its decarbonization, and France is fully committed to achieving the ambitious objectives set out in the Paris Accords. Climate action is an environmental necessity and our collective responsibility, and in that regard, it is a core focus of French public policies. But first of all, let's remind a few facts and figures. France's emissions have dropped by 18.5% between 1990 and 2018, with about 101 megatons of CO2 less from 1990. And right now, France is one of the lowest per capita emissions among developed countries. This is, of course, due in no small part to the advance taken in the choice of a low-carbon energy mix in France, mobilizing nuclear energy. As such, the French electrical system had emissions around 58.5 grams per kilowatt hour, compared to an average European value around 300 grams. Nonetheless, the French carbon footprint has risen to 11.2 tons per inhabitant in 2019 from 10.5 in 1995. And this is attributable to the outsourcing of several emissive activities, in particular in basic materials such as heavy chemistry or metallurgy, and to the development of new forms of consumption, increasing the imported footprint. So maintaining this course would be not only environmentally and technically unsound, but also raises deep questions of social and political acceptability of the transition. And as the recent crisis has only too acutely reminded us, maintaining access to key industrial commodities and a robust industrial basis in Europe is an essential component of our collective resilience and our strategic autonomy. As such, decarbonizing European and French industry is an essential common objective and a key focus of our governmental action. So, first of all, achieving our collective climate goals is a core focus of the stimulus plan, France Relance, which is an unprecedented effort to transform our economy, mobilizing 100 billion euros, of which 30 billion are earmarked for the ecological transition. Our choice is to invest in priority in those sectors contributing to tomorrow's growth and jobs, and decarbonizing is undoubtedly one of the foremost sectors. Within France Relance, 1.2 billion euros are dedicated specifically for industrial decarbonization through several instruments, all of which have been set up and are operating right now. First, a tender for projects in industrial energy efficiency, aiming at large-scale efforts above 3 million euros, combined with a request for proposals in the specific field of process change with a broad scope, including electrification or material efficiency. Secondly, a tender for fuel change in the industrial heat production, 3 million euros investments and above, helping sites to make the investments necessary and providing for a CFD type support, ensuring the competitiveness over a 15-year period of low carbon fuels such as biomass compared with the replaced fossil fuels. Finally, we have set up for small and medium enterprises a simple subsidy for small-scale projects in energy efficiency with a de minimis aid for standardized investments. In total, for the two tenders, about 100 projects have already emerged in the two above-mentioned tenders in less than 1 month and a half. And they are currently being studied very closely to be able to deliver the aid before the end of the year. They demonstrate the confidence of industries in decarbonization as a key tool to maintain their performance and competitiveness in the prospect of the economic rebound. Secondly, the stimulus plan also provides for the future technologies, and in particular hydrogen, with 2 billion euros up to 2022 within the French National Hydrogen Strategy. And this strategy will deliver 7 billion euros up to 2030 to support the emergence of a French and European hydrogen solutions sector within an IPCEI, coordinating its development with the implementation of supports for hydrogen use. Hydrogen is a very relevant energy vector for decarbonization as long as it is sourced from low carbon electricity, whether nuclear or renewable. And we will support both uses as an industrial feedstock, for example, in refining, in heavy chemistry, in steel manufacturing, and also as a solution for heavy mobilities in local frameworks. The French climate component of our National Integrated Energy Climate Plan, the Stratégie Nationale Bas Carbone, SNBC, sets our core objectives to meet our collective climate goals with minus 40% in 2030, on track to carbon neutrality in 2050. And this strategy details sector by sector the objectives. And in the case of industry, the objective is to reach 53 megatons emission in 2030 from 79 megatons in 2018. So this means we have 26 megatons to suppress in the industry over the period. And this is something we want to achieve without any loss of industrial value added on the French territory, and ideally developing new. 10 to 15 megatons can certainly be addressed through the approaches within the stimulus plan via available technologies such as energy efficiency, low carbon fuels for industrial heat, electrification. And we think that about 6 megatons additional can be developed through the massification of hydrogen use within the National Hydrogen Strategy. Now it is our responsibility to identify industrial sector by industrial sector, the volumes of decarbonization that are achievable, the technologies enabling them, the regulatory barriers, and the costs per ton of those volumes. And this exercise is currently being done for the key emitting industries, which are structured in sector committees, in metallurgy, in chemistry, in construction materials. And this will help us precise the path beyond the stimulus plan to reach our goals. And this exercise will be done, is already in progress, but will be finalized over the first semester of next year. This encompassing industrial decarbonization strategy is a key exercise that will help us define the appropriate tools necessary, including state aid, to transform industries and help it produce with the same value in Europe while reducing its footprint, instead of moving its footprint out of the EU. In that regard, the implementation of carbon contracts for difference is a very interesting tool, which has been detailed in many economic works. I think about what the IDRI has produced and what Agoreg Energiewende also has developed on this concept, which will need to be considered in much detail. So secondly, and regarding the minus 55%, because so far our strategy is based on minus 40%, and now we have to get ready for this increased ambition. And in the State of the Union address on September 16th, Mrs. von der Leyen announced the increase of the decarbonization target to minus 55%, including LULUCF. I have no idea how it's supposed to be pronounced, and identified 3 ways to meet this goal: an improvement of the ETS scheme, energy efficiency, in particular in residential and tertiary uses, and the mobilization of sectoral legislation. French authorities, of course, welcome the increased ambition as a collective challenge and as a token of our joint will to set the European commitment to climate action as an example. First, reaching this ambitious goal will need an intensification of our efforts to decarbonize industrial processes, as detailed above. This effort will be moot if we do not improve at the same time the functioning of the EU ETS system, as set out by Commission President, but also if we do not improve the tools to mitigate carbon leakage. And in that regard, the European Green Deal has committed to implement a border carbon adjustment scheme by 2023, which is a measure we consider an absolute necessity and support wholeheartedly. Its implementation is the integral companion of any intensification of our climate action if we do not want to see the supports for industrial decarbonization undermined by an extra European competition that does not pay the true price of carbon. We should, in that regard, remain very mindful of the impacts, which will be precised in the Commission's impact study, and identify a robust list of pilot sectors to be developed further, eventually encompassing industrial sectors further downstream in the value chain in order to secure our efforts. Reaching this goal also means enabling the appropriate tools, including state aid. The current guidelines for state aid in the energy and environment sector, currently under a process of revision, only deal with decarbonization of energy production and energy vectors, or mostly deal with those. And we think they could legitimately evolve in 2021 to integrate energy uses and decarbonization, which is integrally linked with the energy consumption, in particular in the framework of industry decarbonization. They would, in that regard, be the perfect tool to provide a common framework for decarbonization support, while providing member states with the adequate tools to experiment the most appropriate solutions in their specific national situation. Finally, to reach this goal, we will need some neutrality in the approach. 1 ton of emissions avoided is a ton less damaging our climate. We should, of course, remain mindful of the sustainability of technologies, but a fair and balanced approach regarding the delegated acts of the taxonomy regulation will be, of course, a key issue. In conclusion, as you very well know, the Greek crisis means both choice and decision. We are right now at a historic time where we can choose to bootstrap our decarbonization within our stimulus plans and move forward to meet our targets. And this choice is the choice we made.
Thank you, Pierre. So I'm reminding our audience we have about 10 minutes for a Q&A with the 2 first panelists before we move on to the presentation by my colleague Oliver Sator. Janne, how is the situation out there on questions from the audience?
Good morning from my side. So today looking at the questions from the audience. So far we have one from Lars Nielsen, who is asking if you could discuss a bit more about the potential of using less material in general and what policies should be or are there to use less material to have more material efficiency or possibly even sufficiency, as he states.
Okay, so generally speaking, the question of the role of material efficiency, enhancing materials efficiency as part of efficiency policies, but also circular economy policies, I suppose, to enabling more effective industrial processes and thereby reducing emission levels in the long term. I would kind of team up this question perhaps with a question first to Pierre, and perhaps Antoine, you may comment on it. Pierre, when I was listening to what you were saying, my impression was that by and large, at the moment, the French efforts to bring industry on a track to reaching 2030 targets is going well. And there's not so much beyond, let's say, state aid flexibility that you would see needs to be done at the European level. You did mention the ETS debate, where the Commission has already announced it will propose a reform of the current system as part of increasing 2030 ambition. You did refer to border carbon adjustment as one mechanism to help European industry cope with higher costs of carbon emissions. But beyond that, I didn't hear anything very specific where you would say, now this is what we need in the next year, in the next legislative cycle from the European level in order to move to the higher ambition on minus 55%. And I'm thinking specifically on the very, very strong role of the European legislator in forming the internal markets, which of course is very relevant for all of industrial production. And we do have framework legislation on industrial emissions, etc. Is there anything that you would specifically hope will be part of the future package from a French perspective? Beyond the points BCA, ETS reform that you mentioned.
Right now, as I mentioned, we have engaged in a very detailed process to review on a sectorial basis in metallurgy, in construction materials, in chemistry, what exactly are the industrial processes that would need to be decarbonized, what is the volume of megatons that is available, and which technologies are required to address it, and to identify the regulatory barriers and the proper state aid tools. So this process is being performed, and we expect to see its first conclusion within the upcoming 3 to 4 months. And in parallel, we have conducted quite a lot of reflection on what this would imply regarding state aid mechanisms. And so far, the stimulus plan has been a very interesting challenge to deploy additional tools within a very short period. And what we put in place in the stimulus plan will be helpful to meet our commitment, but will probably not be sufficient by 2030. We will need to find something else. Nonetheless, those tools had a lot of advantages. They were available technologically because changing fossil fuels by biomass in heating is quite simple to do. Energy efficiency is a very mature business with lots of dedicated consulting companies that can help the industrial activities to find the proper tools. And so those two aspects, they were already there, and it was a perfect tool for a stimulus plan. But now we need to think about how we will go further. Hydrogen is a very interesting case because it enables us to test the proper design of not only investment aids, but also to functioning aids. And of course, we have noticed with much interest the discussions in neighboring member states regarding hydrogen, and in particular, the role that CFD schemes, and in particular carbon CFDs, could play in the design of hydrogen use aids. And there is currently consideration at the technical level whether carbon CFDs as a more generalized approach could not be an efficient solution that could be integrated in the upcoming guidelines. And of course, it's up to the ministers to make announcements, but this is something we are currently studying in much detail, looking at what economists have produced, what think tanks such as Agro-Energiewende have produced, and also what is the current mindset of the various industrial federations, both at the national and the European level.
Okay. One topic you both mentioned was carbon contracts for difference, or contracts for difference. Antoine, perhaps you can reflect on that, because you also mentioned it. To my understanding, there is currently no specific framework on contracts for difference at European level. Is the Commission planning to at least give some guidance on how such contracts for difference could be established, and by when, if you plan to do this, would you do this? How do you see this coming into the picture? Because you did mention that the ETS reform alone and also border carbon adjustment as a mechanism will not be sufficient to give a robust investment framework. So I assume that contracts for difference will need to play a role also from your perspective.
Yes, I mean, of course, it was a more general point that you need a broader set of policies beyond the ETS, but I think indeed contracts for difference can play a role. I think it's a tool that that has worked well in the field of renewables, and that it is worth looking into. What we have already kind of flagged in our hydrogen strategy is that we think pilot schemes could be developed, for example, in trying to accelerate replacing production of hydrogen in refineries, fertilizer production, but that could include also low carbon steel, basic chemicals, and yes, I mean this is something that could be possibly done with the support of the Innovation Fund at EU level, but this is a topic for reflection more broadly for state aid, because this is also something that potentially could be done at national level. Of course, we still need to assess carefully, I would say, the potential market impact, the impact on competition of such measures, and their proportionality. But if you look at the public consultation that we have launched recently on the future revised state aid guidelines on energy and environment, which are due for adoption next year, this is something that we ask feedback about specifically. So we continue to pursue this and to explore this.
Mm-hmm. One concern that I've heard in some debates on carbon contracts for difference, so as you are saying, and as I also understand from Pierre, is that this is at the moment seen primarily as a national decision whether to give some support to certain parts of industry for some particular investments, as you mentioned, kind of the first big projects, through carbon contracts for difference or contracts for difference. Now, one concern that I've heard repeatedly is, but this will only be possible for some member states that do have the ability to pay. And what is happening in other parts of Europe? Is this something, because both of you didn't mention much the social transition part of moving to greenhouse gas neutral industry, is this something being debated, how you deal with the different capacities of member states to support investments into the green transition? Is this something debated in the Commission? Is it something debated in France? Perhaps it's can I invite both of you to comment on that? Because to me, that's one of the key questions actually in the debate.
Yes, can I go first?
Yes, please, Antoine.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it is obviously something discussed within the Commission, I would say, by definition, because we are very mindful of that. I mean, but that's also an inherent issue with all state aid matters. You have, on the one hand, the EU financial tools, the EU programs, and on the other hand, what member states can do. But I don't want to give an impression that this is only for the national level. I think we could also do pilot schemes at EU level. I mentioned the Innovation Fund before, and we had recently a call that concluded for the Innovation Fund. So we will be looking at the project, the proposals are being assessed. We will be looking at that. But I think also looking at the substantial issue that you raise, which is basically the different abilities of member states to provide this type of financing, and that's valid across the board for other forms of support. I think it's very significant that we are addressing the current crisis with a joint framework, and that the EU will go on financial markets to raise money and to provide support, including in the form of grants directly to member states for their recovery efforts. And so, as I said, support to breakthrough technologies, support to energy-intensive industries, which clearly and directly help to achieve our targets, the Green Deal and the climate targets, could also play a part in those recovery plans. And here we have a mechanism that ensures that member states who may be on their own would not have the capacity, or the same capacity at least, will get. I mean, there is a solidarity mechanism here with this joint recovery plan of Next Generation EU. And by the way, in some member states, the contribution of Next Generation EU, so the money they will get through the Resilience and Recovery Facility, will be very substantial in terms of share of GDP.
Okay, thank you. Pierre, perhaps in your comment, you can also pick up on the reskilling agenda. If you think about industrial transformation, this is not only about replacing one technology with another, but also about retraining the workforce. And, how do you deal with that challenge in the French debate domestically that you have been describing?
Yes, so this topic about retraining and adapting the industrial competencies that exist to the new needs of the economy is, of course, a very important part of the reflection in that regard. A good example is once again the hydrogen strategy, because when we look at where projects are coming, they are mostly coming in areas that used to have long-standing experience in energy, and sometimes with a focus in fossil fuels. And a good example is that chemical platforms, refineries, and also the regions with a very long history in mastering power production from fossil fuels, such as Belfort, all are poles where there is a lot of attention from the hydrogen actors to develop their activity. And we are very focused to ensure that this is an asset to redeploy the workforce and to accompany the transition in a territorial coherence. And this is for us a very important dimension of the idea, insofar as basically to develop hydrogen, you still need competencies that already exist. You need people skilled in electrical engineering. You will need pressure vessels. You will need complicated metallurgy. And in the end, it will still be in the continuity competence-wise, while it will be very sharp change and turn regarding emissions.
Okay, thank you. We are coming to the end of this part of the webinar. I would like to raise one last question that was posed by Lars Nilsson, specifically to you, Antoine. And this is, are you trying to engage with other countries, meaning non-EU countries, in an effort to build alliances and coalitions on some of those industrial sectors that we are discussing when we talk, primarily discussing when we talk about greenhouse gas neutral industry? So more the external dimension of the Green Deal.
Well, yes, I mean, the external dimension is very, very important to the Green Deal. I think the most important thing in that respect will be the COP of Glasgow next year. I think we already see, as I said also in my intervention, that some countries and some important ones are moving. We know also that the president-elect in the US wants to go back into the Paris Agreement. The China announcement, I think, is significant and a positive step. Of course, we will have to see the implementation. But all of that shows that I think it's not, of course, the only reason, because all those countries see the need for themselves to be ambitious on climate, but also the leadership that Europe has taken is also producing results. And I think there will be scope for cooperation on industrial aspects with other parts of the world. That's for sure, and we are working on that. I just want to, as it's the end of the panel, I just want to say that I wanted not to be too long, so I mistakenly, because I should have mentioned it, but I didn't address the social aspects in my intervention. But this is key to everything we do. Just very briefly, the Just Transition Mechanism and the Just Transition Fund. So we will really put a very sustained effort on accompanying the regions which are most affected by the transformation. And that includes, of course, coal regions, so to speak, but also more generally regions which rely a lot on energy-intensive industries, where the transformation challenge is very big as well. And we will also put a lot of focus on skills, on upskilling, reskilling, with all our tools, including the European Social Fund. So the just transition in a broad sense is a central aspect to everything we do. I just wanted to mention that before finishing.
Thank you. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Pierre, for opening the debate this morning. You were touching on many things. I see in the Q&A window, we didn't pick up many of the questions that were coming in. Some were quite technical. Others, I believe, we can take up at the roundtable a bit later, as they are more specifically on different sectors, also on the reskilling challenges. So speaking also to the union perspective in that picture. But let's move to the next part of this webinar. Many thanks, Antoine. Many thanks, Pierre, to you for joining us this morning. Antoine, I understand you will need to leave us in a few minutes to another meeting. And Pierre, if you want to stay with us, you're very welcome also to contribute further to the debate. So let's move to the next agenda item, which is a paper that was published, I believe, on the 29th of October, titled A Clean Industry for Your Package. It was mainly authored by my colleague Oliver Sator, who will now present the main messages from this paper. This paper is not a self-standing exercise, but it is articulating our perspective as Agora Energiewende on the European debate and what we would hope to have the focus on in the European debate to move the next necessary steps towards a greenhouse gas neutral industry in Europe. There is also a broad work stream that is being done by Agora Energiewende, in part in cooperation with Wuppertal Institute, going deep on the different sectors that have to go through the transition. And indeed, we are publishing today the summary of a much broader study that will only be fully available in January, which is titled Breakthrough Strategies for Climate Neutral Industry in Europe. And this paper, this broader study will very much look into technology pathways for raising EU climate ambition. But of course, some of the substantive findings from this much more technical analysis is also picked up by Oliver in his presentation now on what do we need, what do we expect from the European debate over the next few months and years. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm just uploading my presentation.
Yes. And perhaps before Oliver, before you start, just to remind all those out there listening in to this webinar, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose substantive questions to now the presentation of Oliver and subsequently to the panelists on the roundtable. And you can please use the chat window for any technical questions that you have to us in supporting you to fully participate and benefit from this webinar. So Oli, please go ahead.
Thank you, Matthias. I have the honor today to present the work of Agora on a clean industry package for Europe. I have the disadvantage, however, that it appears that I'm losing my voice today. I think it will hold out for the next 15 minutes, but please bear with me on that front. So as mentioned by Matthias, these are the two studies that he was referring to. If you'd like to know more about the assumptions or the detailed policy recommendations, I strongly encourage you to go to our website and to look more at the detail. I'll only be able to present a fraction of all of this work today. So just to step back a little bit and to take a broader perspective, what's really clear is that if the EU wants to raise its climate ambition, we have to really kickstart a step change in our effort on industry. So industry is about 20% of the CO2 emissions of the European Union. And despite the fact that we made some progress in the 90s and 2000s by improving emissions, since 2010, our performance has more or less stagnated. We now need to make a step change, obviously, to achieve a higher 2030 target. But in particular, we have to do this in a way that's compatible with a much deeper 2050 target for industry. The situation is also quite urgent because we actually have an investment cycle which is coming up in the next 10 years, where for major energy-intensive sectors like steel, chemicals, and cement, between 30 to 53%, we estimate, of the existing assets will need major reinvestment and modernization. And because these are very long-lived assets, the risk that we face is if we don't seize this moment to not just do demonstration plants, but to implement key low-carbon technologies for climate neutrality, we either risk locking in conventional technologies until 2050, or we actually risk creating an environment where these investments can't happen and we actually put jobs and European industry at risk. So one might answer the question, well, first of all, is a minus 55% actually feasible for energy-intensive industry? So this is one of the questions we look at. And the answer is we think it's definitely feasible. The question is not if, but how. So to give you a sense of what I mean, this graph here shows you the emissions in the European Union emissions trading scheme and what a minus 55% target would mean until 2030. So emissions would have to decline by 65% compared to the baseline by 2030 to help the EU achieve that target. However, what we need to take into account is that much of the effort has already been done in previous years. And in addition, looking forward, actually the power sector would be driving a large share of the effort until 2030. So that leaves industry with about 142 megatons to abate to achieve this goal, which is roughly a 27% reduction on current emissions. The question, therefore, is not, this is definitely feasible. In fact, the European Commission itself in its impact assessment explains that this 142 megatons could essentially be met just by improving the process efficiency and energy efficiency of existing assets and existing technologies. Now, this may be true. The concern that we have at Agora, however, is that this is not necessarily consistent with the 2050 target. So one of the things we looked at in our analysis was, is it actually possible to take this 142 megatons that you see on the left of the graph here and actually achieve it by deploying key low carbon technologies that are compatible with the 2050 climate neutrality goal? And what we find is that actually if we seize this investment cycle that's coming up, it definitely is possible. So actions like, deploying direct reduced iron in the steel sector, power to heat and green hydrogen, using the fact that the power sector will be decarbonizing substantially by 2030, starting to develop chemical recycling initially by 2030, and also oxy-fuel and CCS in the cement sector. And what we find is that in these three sectors alone, which not even all of the energy intensive in the ETS, we could actually achieve roughly 145 megatons of abatement with a bit of space to spare. So we definitely think it's possible by 2030 to start to deploy key low carbon technologies compatible with the 2050 goal. We also sometimes hear, I think, in the discussion that, well, many of these key breakthrough technologies are for after 2030. Right now, it's about innovation or research and developing pilots and so on. We actually think this is true in some cases, but not all cases. And a good example is the steel sector. So in the steel sector, what we see is that DRI technology, as I mentioned, there are already 3 companies that are developing commercial scale, industrial scale sites to be commercialized by 2025-26 and scale up the full use of hydrogen and the level of production by 2030. So these include the hybrid project in Sweden, the DRI Galati project by Liberty Steel in Romania, and the TKH2 Steel project by ThyssenKrupp in Germany, which have already been committed to. And the thing is, if it's possible for these 3 actors to do this, it's also possible for a bunch of other actors to do it. And in fact, they're realizing this, which is why I listed 4 more projects here, which are basically feasibility studies or demonstration plants which want to pursue a similar course of action. So the steel sector is telling us that actually the industry is already willing to move faster if the policy framework is in place. Similarly, in the cement sector, there's several abatement options which need to be deployed to get to neutrality. So it's not as simple as just carbon capture and storage. However, carbon capture and storage is interesting in the cement sector precisely because it's one of the ways that if we introduce a little bit of biomass into the heating of the cement kilns, we can ultimately develop negative emissions from the cement sector. And so it's a way of also contributing to the infrastructure for bioenergy-based CCS. Our analysis suggests that even if we take a conservative view, approximately 11 well-located sites on the Atlantic or in the north of Europe in the Baltic could potentially have shipping of CO2 to offshore storage sites in the North Sea by 2030 if we put the infrastructure in place and if we have the right incentives. The key issue, though, however, is obviously the policy framework and the economic incentives. And we discussed this a little bit in the previous panel, so I won't go into it too much. But this graphic is just to show you that, we talk a lot about carbon pricing, a border adjustment mechanism, or even these industry alliances, but actually that's not enough by itself. The costs of the key technologies, as you can see on this graphic here, are often significantly higher than not only the current CO2 price, but also the expected CO2 prices that we would have under higher ETS ambitions. So we need complementary policies, which is one of the reasons why we talk a lot about carbon contracts for difference. However, it's not as simple as carbon contracts for difference either, unfortunately. The reality is that the industrial transition is complex. And the reason it's complex is because one has to tackle the upstream, midstream, and downstream parts of the value chain. If we want to have decarbonized production process, that means key infrastructure has to be developed. So clean power infrastructure, clean hydrogen infrastructure, CCS infrastructure, raw materials for circular economy have to be there in the upstream part of the value chain. We have to change the production processes in the midstream part of the value chain, and that requires an investment framework to do that. And then we need to actually create markets and an ability to pay for the transformations in the midstream part of the value chain, while also unlocking circular economy and material efficiency downstream. So that's why we actually need a clean industry package. It's not just about a magic bullet. So if I just can take you through this briefly, I won't go through every element of this package. And indeed, some of the elements, there are already steps going in the direction of some of the proposals we're making by the Commission. But I want to emphasize some things that maybe were not so strongly emphasized in the discussion this morning. So one key element obviously is developing clean hydrogen. That's essential. One of the issues here, however, is it's not just about supporting the production of clean hydrogen. It's about supporting in parallel the demand for clean hydrogen, an economic business case for the demand in industrial applications that don't currently use hydrogen. So, steel production, for example, in order to create demand hydrogen, one needs to focus on supporting the demand as well in industry. Another key aspect when we talk about infrastructure development is also the planning tools that we use. So we have these national, planning is critical to unlocking the financing and the regulatory framework in member states for key infrastructure to be developed and expanded to support industrial transformation. At present, however, industry has largely been off the radar when we develop these national energy plans that then affect the way we expand our networks. And so national energy and climate plans and other planning tools need to start to focus much more on this to unlock the financing, to unlock the investments. If we focus then on the midstream part of the value chain, here essentially the key issue is about how can we create a robust case for large-scale investments to really get a full pipeline of projects actually moving. We actually think we need scale to actually bring the cost down and to help the industry have confidence to move in the right direction. And that means a robust investment case has to confront industry. So this is partly about carbon contracts for difference, as we've discussed. It's partly about de-risking instruments, as Mr. Colombani mentioned, such as InvestEU and the Innovation Fund. However, it's also about some other tools. So, for example, if we want to develop support instruments like contracts for difference, we need to be clear on what is a climate neutral breakthrough technology. What are the technologies that we actually think should be supported? What is consistent with the long-term strategy? And so here, criteria and standards we actually think will be essential as part of that enabling framework and to also to facilitate the state aid. And obviously a robust anti-carbon leakage framework will be essential. Indeed, in the long run, we expect, or the midterm, we expect we'll need to move to a framework that is sustainable, that not only protects, not just protects the incumbent assets, but actually protects the future decarbonized green assets for industry. In the short term, however, we also need to think maybe about some tweaks to our existing tools like free allocation and state aid in order to make them really robust for much higher carbon prices than we've seen in the past. And if we focus finally on the downstream part of the value chain, there's a few things that need to happen. One key element that came up in the previous discussion was how do we actually pay for things like carbon contracts for difference across the EU? So one of our proposals here is this idea of a climate surcharge on final products in the value chain, which are not exposed to carbon leakage, essentially as a way of embedding the cost of the upstream decarbonisation into the final products. We think that with very small cost increases for consumers in the order of 1% of the cost of a building or a car, we could raise more than enough money to support the transformation of all of these assets that need to be transformed in the next 10 years. So that's one key element. But at the same time, we also have to unlock we have to create markets for low carbon products, right? So we can do this in the private sector through things like labeling and requirements for embedded CO2 in products. So in things like buildings, vehicles, and so on. We can also do this by public procurement, which is another important lever that we can pull. It's not sufficient by itself, but we can add that to the mix. And then the final thing we have to do downstream is to actually create the conditions for a more circular use of basic materials. And this is actually not as simple as just setting recycling targets. It's actually about the quality of the materials. What we need to do is to have, in both the design of the materials, but also the end-of-life treatment of the materials, incentives that actually ensure that we can recover the material value, such that we have higher ratio, we can actually replace primary materials with secondary materials, because otherwise we have a kind of downgrading effect that limits our capacity to really develop a truly circular economy. So in a nutshell, that's the clean industry package, but we can go into more detail in the discussion, or you can also look at our reports. One final point I'd like to make, however, is this may seem like a lot of instruments, What we're not trying to do, however, is to reinvent the wheel. We're not trying to create 10 new directives or regulations for each one of these new ideas. Rather, what we're saying is already in the Green Deal and in the legislative and other instruments that are on the table for revision, these issues can fit into those tools. So it's actually about having a coordinated approach, an integrated approach, a vision for what industry needs, and to make sure that those needs are reflected in what we're going to revise anyway. So it's actually about streamlining the process or mainstreaming industry in the actual Green Deal adequately. So in summary, the situation is urgent. We have to start making these investments by 2030. We won't get there just on CO2 prices and border adjustments alone. We need additional instruments. We think we need a clean industry package to really tackle all of the barriers along the value chain, to really create the confidence for investors that the transition is happening and they can commit to it fully, and to develop a big pipeline of projects. And in addition, this can be done to a large extent by adapting existing tools. So it doesn't have to be an extremely cumbersome process. So Matthias, I might hand back over to you for the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Oliver, for this impulse. And I didn't come back to Antoine Colombani when he made reference, I don't know if you picked it up, Oliver, that the Commission is planning to update its industrial strategy as part of the big package next year. So to me, this was, because this is something not yet, which doesn't feature in the Commission work program for 2021. I didn't see it there. So it seems that also in the Commission, there is some movement in the sense of they're realizing they need to be, let's say, creating a stronger narrative around the topic of industrial decarbonization in Europe, which I find positive, of course. Now, let's move to the panel. We have three panelists for our roundtable, and just for all those out there, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to ask direct questions at our panelists. My colleagues Janne Görlach and Vido Viteka are going through what's coming through this Q&A window and will pose the questions after the first impulse statements by our panelists. We will start with Adolfo Aiello. He's the Director for Energy and Climate at Eurofair, the European Steel Industry Association. And now, Adolfo, I just picked up in Oliver's presentation, he essentially said the steel industry is ready to move and to move fast. Is this correct? How does the steel industry at the moment look at the challenge of drastically reducing emissions from the sector and to put in place the new technologies, or to invest into the technologies that are available, as Oliver was identifying, to significantly reduce the emissions from the sector? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Agora Energiewende, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. Indeed, we as steel industry are extremely advanced in, let's say, preparing our homeworks for the transition to climate neutrality. We have also recently issued a paper which says, "We are ready, is the EU ready?" So let's say in order to deliver our homework, let's say the result does not rely only on our own companies and on our own sector, but it depends strongly also on the surrounding conditions. I found the Agora's paper extremely useful and comprehensive. I wanted to structure my follow-up on 3 points: the sense of urgency, the strategic importance of energy intensive, and the comprehensive policy framework. I will focus a bit more on the third one, of course. On the sense of urgency, that's quite obvious. We are midway between 1990 and 2050 climate neutrality. So the path to make is longer than what we have done so far, which means that we need to accelerate the speed of the transition. In this, the framework conditions are essential. That's why we support the Agora's message that we need these conditions as early as possible. What we want to, let's say, caution a bit on the industry side. There was a presentation about some projects. I just want to clarify this is just a short list. There are several other companies and with different technology options. So it's important that the transition is done in a technology neutral way in order to reduce the overall cost. And secondly, also taking into account the timeline of the revamping of the existing technology, of the existing sites, which is always an option. And that one has a shortened time frame than a full investment in a new project. The second issue is the strategic importance of energy intensive. It's not only economic importance, it's also environmental importance. Here, I want to quote few extracts of the Commission Impact Assessment on 2030. Out of 350 pages, I wanted to quote tables 16 and table 23 for those interested. What you will see there is the impact on fragmented and homogeneous international climate policy across the European society. You will find there that some sectors of the economy in the EU will inevitably be affected in a negative way. These are the fossil fuel industries. Some others will be positively affected, construction and electricity. And then you have in between energy intensive, which can be positive or negative affected depending on the regulatory framework. And this is essential, not only for the economic potential, because we untap more economic growth potential if these sectors are developed in Europe, but also from an environmental perspective. I think the successful transformation of energy intensive is essential to have a really climate neutral economy and not only a net zero economy. Net zero means that you just compensate what you are producing with what you are absorbing. But in theory, in that scenario, you could still import a lot of CO2 in your materials. If you produce those materials in Europe and you produce them in a climate neutral way, then you are really achieving not only net zero, but a climate neutrality. The third point, which is, let's say, the longer one, is about the comprehensive policy framework. Here again, the Commission Impact Assessment, page 121, acknowledges that carbon price alone will not be sufficient to the low carbon technologies. I want to stress that this is for a very good reason, in the sense that if tomorrow morning there is 100 euros carbon price, those technologies would be competitive, but our companies would be bankrupt. So there is a very good reason why the carbon price cannot explode too quickly. So in this, we need comprehensive policy framework. That's an important change of mindset in Brussels compared to a few years ago when only ETS was supposed to drive. And here what is important is to balance breakthrough changes of the policy framework with incremental improvements of the policy framework. Just few comments on some of the issues that have been mentioned. The need for carbon leakage protection and level playing field. This need is even stronger than before. As it was mentioned by Oli, it's not only about protecting incumbents, but also protecting the low carbon investments. As you could see from that list of companies, the same companies producing today steel with conventional technologies will be those that will make investments in the low carbon technologies. So if you are protecting them, you are also protecting their future investments. If in short term you increase unilaterally their compliance cost, we hear some statements about possible reduction or even removal of reallocation. That would be very, very detrimental because you undermine their financial ability. Then the second one has to do with the funding support and the risking. Here, I want to quote the recent experience of the first call of the Innovation Fund, just to be aware of the magnitude of the challenge. The applications were for 22 billion euros and the available money is 1 billion euro. So we need to be aware of the magnitude of this challenge. Carbon contracts for difference. I think now it's not anymore the issue of the if. I think there is broad support for them. What matters is the how, and we should strive to avoid the same failure of the NER 300 with CCS. I hear from my members a lot of nervousness when contracts for difference are described only as a difference with ETS carbon price, because that assumes a full auctioning on their conventional side. That would be, again, ignoring the international picture, which is still there, international competition. Consumption charges is something that can be explored, but very carefully. Do not forget that steel has CO2 emissions, but it's also permanently recyclable. So we should not undermine this. And last but not least, most of what I said was contained in the Master Plan of Energy Intensive Industries, which was developed 1 year ago. That master plan was titled Master Plan for Competitive Transformation of Energy Intensive Industries, Enabling Climate Neutral Economy. I want to underline the competitive word, because this transformation is either competitive and successful, or it's not, because we live in an international competitive world. Thanks a lot, and hopefully with the Q&A I can come back with some points.
Many thanks, Adolfo, for your initial impulse. We're now moving to Rob van der Meer. He is the Director of EU Public Affairs with Heidelberg Cement, one of the major global companies active in the construction business. Rob, listening to the presentation and to the first two impulse statements by Antoine Colombani and Pierre Jérémy, what's your perspective from this, particularly the cement sector, on the picture as it is developing? Do you feel comfortable? Do you know where things are moving? How do you see the contribution of your sector to achieving greenhouse gas neutrality by latest 2050?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me for this webinar, and also to give some the possibility to give some input. And I first have to say that I see, from personal perspective, a real challenge, because the report from Agora Energiewende, how to say it, it's quite good. So how to put that then in a perspective of the cement industry or of Heidelberg Cement? And I have, in fact, three things that I wanted to share with you. The first one is on how we look at the situation in the cement industry and how we can manage to become carbon neutral, and how this report fits into it. I think first, we see a lot of things in common. I also have to say that some of the details, I have some challenges on it. But also what is more important, apart from this Agora Energiewende report, is the fact that I see that industry and NGOs are having now common ideas about how the future of decarbonization of the industry should happen. And I think that is a good step forward. We don't agree on all things, that's okay. That would be really rather strange, but I think it's good that we have at least common ideas how to move forward. Then a little bit about what Heidelberg Cement is doing on this. We have put down as first energy intensive industry in the world our targets for 2030 to the Science-Based Target Initiative, and being approved as being within the 2 degrees scenario of the Paris Agreement. I think that was a major step. A lot of other companies now followed, and that's good, and it has to be done. Second step that we have made is last year we committed as cement industry, as concrete industry, Heidelberg Cement, to become carbon neutral in 2050 on concrete. To be honest, that is a major step. And we don't have all these solutions. I come back on that. But it shows that industry, or at least my company, is moving on this in big steps. We don't have all the answers, but that is okay. We will find these answers. And that brings me to the three conditions that I want to see in this discussion, and that I also see somehow in the perspective of the paper. For me, there are, in fact, the pillar, the house of decarbonization of the industry is based on 3 pillars. And if you want, there should be concrete pillars, but okay, that's for me only. So 3 pillars. The first pillar is the technical development of the decarbonization processes itself. New products, alternative fuels for cement industry, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use, name it, that is being developed by industry. And you also heard that from Adolfo, you see it everywhere. This is happening. So from a perspective of a technical view to the industries, you can say that we don't have all the answers for 2050 carbon neutrality, but the answers will come. It's in progress, and you see it happening, and everyone is moving on that. So the first technical pillar of that decarbonization house is available and will come. The second condition, and that is mentioned in the report also, but I want to make it a little bit broader, is the infrastructure around that. We need a CO2 infrastructure. We need a hydrogen infrastructure. We need a renewable energy infrastructure. We need a recycling structure. All that is not yet available, and we need it urgently. It's part of the paper, but for me, it's not covering everything on that. So the second pillar is being constructed, but it's not yet there, and we have a lot of challenges there. We also have challenges in the European countries to achieve that pillar. The third pillar is for me a much more challenging one at the end, and that is the policy framework and the societal framework that we need to go into that decarbonization of the industry and decarbonization of the society at the end. Because we need to have predictable legislation to allow industry to do the investments. We have to cover the whole value chain of the products when we are thinking about decarbonization. We should not only focus on the emissions, but we should focus on the whole value chain. So for me, that construction of the decarbonization house, one pillar is being constructed and well on its way, the technical pillar, okay. The infrastructure pillar, there is a lot to be done, but especially the political framework, the society framework, are we as citizens really willing to pay for low carbon products? Is the government willing to work on low carbon products and use of that? For instance, is the carbon contract for difference. That is a pillar which is only starting to be constructed. So it's a house that is not yet stable, and that should change. And that brings me to what is in fact from that perspective needed. First, I think that, and it was mentioned also, we need for industry to have a global level playing field for industry to move on decarbonization. It can't be that you have high CO2 costs in one area of the world and in other areas nothing. You will see imports, you will see changes, you will see carbon leakage, but especially investment leakage. And I think that is one of the fundamentals that has to be addressed. And when I see at the same time that the Commission in the last publications, last press statements is already withdrawing a little bit from that by having perhaps USA entering the Paris Agreement again, I don't think that is the solution, certainly not for cement industry. The challenge is coming from outside Europe to the cement industry in Europe, but it's not coming from the USA or from China. It's coming from other countries. The second point that I think is needed for this is that predictable legislation. And to be honest, the current legislation developments in Europe are a clear example that we do not have predictable legislation. 1st of January, the EU ETS Phase 4 starts. We don't have a decision on border adjustments. We don't have even a decision on the target for 2030. We don't have benchmarks, and we don't have, I can continue. That is not the way how you can expect industry to invest in upgrading their installations, and that's mentioned in the paper, in the next 10 years at a significant volume when you don't have any predictability. And that is a challenge. Now, there are more of these things to be discussed in it. I don't want to go into all these discussions because I wanted to limit it to the house of decarbonization of the industry, the 3 pillars, and the 2 fundamental things that we need for industry to be able to move into decarbonization, being that predictable legislation, and secondly, the global level playing field. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for this initial statement. I mean, at a personal level, I think it's encouraging to hear that you very clearly say we need to have a robust framework in place. Now, what we are trying to do through our work recently at the EU level in particular is to sketch out how such a framework could look like. What I'm currently not hearing, and this is a concern for me as a citizen and somebody interested in policy developments, is that industry is actually coming out in support of a comprehensive framework because, as we all know, politicians are very, very much with open ears towards industry. How can we help you remain competitive even when we're moving to higher climate targets in Europe? I think this would be personally a welcome statement to have a clear indication. Yes, we need something specifically from you. I'm observing very much that over the past years, as also Adolfo mentioned, the industry across the different sectors has very much moved from being largely defensive in those debates on climate policy to be much more engaging and really going deeper on the options that exist. But for the next 12 months, I believe it would be really important to understand what is the framework we're looking at, or do we leave it for the time being, which we believe wouldn't be enough, to individual member states supporting individual projects to demonstrate that some things are happening. Now, I'm moving to our third panelist, Judith Kirton-Darling. She is currently the Deputy General Secretary of Industry All, so one of the main trade union associations in Europe. Before, she was an MEP for the Labour Party, representing northeast of England. So she has a very rich background in how EU policy is developing. And Judith, Rob said, I mean, he said what we need to see is the social pillar of the transition, the political pillar of the transition. And I immediately thought that you are one of the best places to comment on where do we stand from a trade union perspective, looking at the different sectors and the value chain that you are dealing with, and from a union perspective, because obviously those citizens in Europe currently being employed in the industry and those future employees in the future greener industries, they do have a major stake in the transition. And we heard in the first statements this morning that yes, it is seen, but it's probably the least articulated aspect of the transition up to this point. So how do you debate it with your membership?
We debate it very, very lively, as you would be expecting, and maybe in response to your comment to Rob, in what I intend to say, you'll hear a very clear call for that strong European action, because that is exactly what European industrial workers are calling for consistently at the moment. So first of all, obviously, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an extremely interesting debate this morning, but also the reports are very useful and timely from our perspective. And in many respects, they sit very neatly with the discussions that we've had within the European industrial manufacturing sectors about what we think the European Union needs to put in place. It's also really useful to have a discussion about the how. How do we get to 2030? How do we get to 2050 and the objectives? Because in many cases, we see a kind of inflationary political debate about the targets that can sometimes bear little reality to what's actually going on in industries, and also the impact of the economic crisis that we're currently right in the middle of in terms of what practically is going on the ground in the sectors that we represent. So as Industrial Europe, we have been really keen to use the crisis. You know, there's a saying, you should never let a good crisis pass you by. We have been really keen to use this crisis and the recovery plans that have been agreed at European level to try and frame the policy framework to propel us in the right direction towards the objectives for 2030 and 2050. That said, we have to recognise that the scale of the challenge and the Commission's impact assessment of moving to minus 55% compared to minus 40% would mean almost a doubling of the efforts to reduce emissions by 2030. This is an enormous challenge that we're facing as a society and industry and workers involved in industry. And reminding of the scale of the challenge, I don't want that to be seen as in any way undermining the objectives. As the trade union movement, we are fully committed to the objective of climate neutrality by 2050. And our debate is basically that we need to have a clear, and in here I would draw on one of the words of Rob's, a predictable and a clear roadmap which allows the 5.3 million workers in all of Europe's energy intensive industries to see how their role in that shift to 2050 and climate neutrality. So it's a really important exercise. And our demand, which was a trade union demand initially stemming from the early 1990s and 1980s for a just transition, is now on the lips of policymakers all across Europe, but also around the world, as included in the Paris Agreement. And the call for a just transition is all the more important in the current economic crisis and the impact that the pandemic's having on our industrial sectors. So I thought I would highlight a couple of points where we strongly welcome the reports that you're presenting, and then a couple of points where we have some questions to launch the debate. So where we strongly support is the call for a clean industry package. We know that the Commission, von der Leyen had already announced that the Commission was going to update the industrial strategy that was published in March. We need now to see a comprehensive plan for energy intensive industries in the beginning of next year. And we can't have an industrial strategy which sees a kind of ETS only or a target and market approach as the complement to the Fit to 55 package that we're waiting for in June next year. So we really welcome the idea that you've put on the table of a very comprehensive industrial strategy for energy intensive industries. We need to see a focus on the investment needs really in a sectoral granularity. We need to go down and dig into tailor-made approaches for sectors. We know that the industrial strategy of the European Union is based around ecosystems, these 14 ecosystems, but the combination of the acceleration of decarbonization and the economic crisis that we're facing means that we actually need to have also a vertical sectoral analysis and vertical sectoral roadmaps alongside that ecosystems approach. And so one of our key demands as trade unions has been to press for sectoral impact assessments on the 2030 package and the roadmap to 2050. And of course, as trade unions, we want to be part of that discussion. This shouldn't be only a discussion with industry, but it should be a discussion also with the workforce if we want the transition to be a just transition. And I was really pleased in the presentation that Oliver gave earlier that it's recognized, and I think Adolfo said this as well, that we're not talking about necessarily in always new players, new innovators. We're talking about change within incumbents. And for us, a just transition isn't only about job destruction and new job creation in new industries, you know, the classic example of losing jobs in coal mines, creating jobs in renewable energy. This is about job transformation in existing industries and existing companies. And that's why Rob's right. The social dimension of the roadmaps has to be as comprehensive as is possible. Obviously, many of the competencies are at national level, but the European Union has a strong framework to frame the social dimension. And up till now, when we see a social dimension, all too often we hear the word skills. And skills is very important. Skills forecasting, training programs, absolutely essential. But that isn't a comprehensive social dimension to the transition that we're seeing. Workers have to be fully involved. We have European rights as workers, worker participation, information and consultation rights. And those rights should be integrated into the framework for this transition, a framework on the anticipation and management of change, if you like. Workers should be recognized as the sources of innovation in their industries and workplaces. All too often, workers and unions are seen as passive recipients of public policy or corporate strategies and not proactive actors in putting forward proposals. And so we would like to see that integrated into a social dimension. Now, a couple of points where we're a bit more cautious in terms of what's been presented. I have to say that based on the idea that we can, by 2030, already see large-scale industrial deployment of some of these breakthrough technologies, we are a little bit skeptical that is possible. We have to see what's actually feasible by 2030 in our sectors. We have to have that roadmap for the longer term, but we have to recognize, and I think both Adolfo and Rob made this point, that our industries are operating inside global markets and face international global competition, trade-related structural challenges like overcapacity and unfair competition. And so we have to frame a discussion about breakthrough technologies in the overall framework of comprehensive industrial policy. And we didn't see that dimension really developed as much as it could be. The second dimension that we think needs to be addressed far deeper is the regional dimension. Different regions across Europe and different countries across Europe have very different capacities. Now, this came out in the debate when we had the first speakers this morning, but it isn't included in the reports. And we would like to see really a comprehensive view of what this transformation means for different regions across Europe. Inside the trade union movement, we're doing a lot of work, for example, of how you create just transition roadmaps and industrial transformation roadmaps in Central and Eastern Europe. We need to have a not one-size-fits-all model, but looking at actually what the implications are and what the dynamics are in different nations, regions, and kind of continental subregions, if you like. The last point is that there's an implicit assumption that with this industrial policy framework, we can trigger investment in the EU to decarbonize. But we fear that it may still be easier for multinational companies operating in these sectors to invest in third countries and then to export back to the European Union. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is obviously, we have been advocating for it for very many years, and we are fully supporting. We have discussions about the details and what it should look like in practice, but it's fundamental for creating that level playing field. But it doesn't necessarily create an incentive to invest in plants located in the EU. And the upstream and the midstream measures that are presented in the report also exist in the third countries that we're competing with. Particularly in China and elsewhere. So what are we doing to avoid the risk that we are essentially trying to buy investments into Europe from multinational companies, avoid it, and how do we create a framework which avoids, on the one hand, windfall profits, and on the other hand, pressure on labour costs and a struggle between the decarbonisation agenda and the labour costs for the workforce. That needs to be factored into the point. My last word, because I've taken my time, is that the scale of the challenge, we believe, demands a radical, urgent policy. And there we stand united in what you've proposed. We think the EU should actually internalise some of the findings of the of economic researchers developing theories around entrepreneurial states. That we should actually become a far more active public policy framework where the state is driving, and we don't always revert back to market mechanisms to make our way forward. And there, I would echo some of the words of Pierre earlier around the absolute importance of reform of state aid and competition rules if we want to really achieve our ambition of decarbonisation by 2050 and the 2030 goals. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Judith. That was very rich and comprehensive, and reminding myself of so many aspects that we, as a think tank focusing more on the technologies and economics of the transition, can learn from, particularly the social dimension, and the whole, the social transition agenda out there that exists. One of the obvious questions on my mind is what we have seen as an initiative by the European Commission and institutions on the coal regions in transition approach, whether this is something that could be replicated. In the meantime, it is linked to very concrete planning activities and obligations of member states that want to access some specific funding, namely so-called geographical transition planning, so which is specific to regions, specific to certain stakeholders in regions, and that might be something to bring back into the debate. I'm reminded we are about 10 minutes before the regular closure of this webinar, and it's difficult to run over time for many reasons. So I would turn to Janne at this point. Janne Göllach, my colleague who has been monitoring the questions coming in. Janne, let's take out perhaps 3-4 of the most pertinent questions that our panelists and perhaps also Olli can address in the final 10 minutes of this webinar. And for all the rest, we would need to come back to you in writing. Apologies for that. Janne.
Okay. Thank you, Matthias. So we have one question from Mr. Nielsen. He says that there are different technology options. One, on the one side, those who can take us to zero emissions. On the other side, those who don't lead to zero emissions, like carbon to chem or Stilano. And he is asking, how can we be technology neutral when the purpose is zero emissions?
That's probably a question, Adolfo, primarily directed at you, and perhaps Oliver, you also have a sense on that, but Adolfo, perhaps.
Yes, I suppose that's for me, and that I can be very brief. First, each time that the technology neutrality principle is disregarded, this comes with a cost, and it should be important. It's important to clarify that. Second issue is what I was saying before. There is also always a graduality in the investments and in the transition. Some technologies can deliver important abatement in short term, and then they can be further fine-tuned in medium term and deliver additional reductions. So you could have from CCU to CCS in longer term when you have the CCS infrastructure in place, or you could move back from CCU to hydrogen-based CCU or other technologies. So it is very, very, very difficult, considering all the uncertainties, the technological, the economic, the political uncertainties, that we write down right now a closed list of technologies. That's quite premature and expensive.
Yeah, Yes, I mean, just to add to that very quickly, I largely agree with Adolfo. It's dangerous to try to write the final list of technologies now. I agree. At the same time, I think we also have to be careful of what we support and don't support, because there'll be large amounts of public money potentially spent on these things. What's critical is that we have criteria for evaluating what do we think is able to be made consistent with the 2050 vision and what's not. And so we see that as being an important part of the enabling framework for things like contracts for difference. So it needs to be open, indeed, but also with some safeguard.
Thank you, Oli. So, Janne, another question that is coming through.
So, Michael Neves says that, or asks, how do you see energy-intensive industries transforming to create and capture value, as well as create jobs further downstream with new, for example, circular business models? He says that this is meaning less emphasis on value of raw materials and production.
It's probably a question to all of the panelists, I would say. Perhaps, Judith, let's start with you, because there's, of course, how do you transform some of the industries? There's an immediate perspective of those employed in those industries, and then perhaps move to Rob and Adolfo.
Yeah, the kind of combined potential of a circular economy agenda at European level, together with an assertive clean industry package, it would actually create the opportunity for shifts. Obviously, the circular economy, part of the problem at the moment is that bottom part of the circular economy is underdeveloped, and so linking in with the agenda around raw materials, which has been recently proposed by the European Commission, is really crucial for us. And what we see is that in a number of energy-intensive industries, actually that creates a real potential for maintaining and extending opportunities in Europe. I'm thinking here in, for example, non-ferrous metals, in some of the extraction and then smelting developments and so on. So there is a positive story to be told in terms of the potential for transformation, but we need that. It's a bit of a stereotype, a bit of a kind of cliche, but we need that joined up policy framework where actually we see the different pieces of the puzzle working in symbiosis, to use a word from the circular economy agenda, to ensure that our industries are able to take full advantage of the policy framework. Maybe one word on your question to me after my intervention. Obviously, we are very, very engaged in the whole development of the Just Transition Fund, Just Transition mechanisms, regional plans across Europe. But we have to recognize that this costs money. Just transition is not cheap as a policy. And if you look at the European financial framework, the funds which have been allocated for Just Transition were slashed by more than half by the European Council, from 40 billion to 17.5 billion. If you contrast that with Germany and the national coal plan for 4 regions, coal regions, they were given a budget of 40 billion. So we are now dealing with 40 coal regions across Europe and the carbon intensive regions across Europe with a pot of money less than half than what was allocated in one member state. That gives you a little bit of a perspective of the challenges that we face in terms of how we finance this, and why it's so vitally important that the social dimension is integrated into the industrial transformation agenda, because that then means that some of that deficit can be recouped elsewhere.
Personally, Judith, it's very hard to challenge anything that's being said, of course, but my sense is that at the moment, the shortage is not of money, but the shortage of public funds put to the transition, but really of the concrete planning and the dialogues with those engaged and that do have a stake in the transition to actually make use of what is being put on the table, at least in some regions in Europe. And I'm fully aware that the German government, of course, is quite,
I think maybe chicken. I would say it's maybe a chicken and egg debate.
Okay, so yeah, but if I would talk about deficit, I would probably not see it at the moment at the availability of funds, but rather at the forward planning to things coming in the very short term from just the commitment to go greenhouse gas neutral by latest 2050. Rob, the cement industry, if you look at the Commission planning and the question that was just posed on circular economy, etc., I spotted there's some work on the construction, it's a building, construction materials for buildings, etc., what the Commission is planning. What do you expect from that for the circular economy aspects?
That would not be my first starting point in this discussion, to be honest. I think that one of the things about the circular economy, I want to split it in two elements. One is we are producing cement and at the end concrete. Concrete is normally quite often in most countries landfilled when its building is demolished. But concrete is absorbing also CO2. And we should use, as concrete cement industry, reuse the concrete waste in our operations, reducing also in that way the climate change emissions, because we can reuse the material and it can absorb CO2 during its end-of-life phase, but also during its life phase itself. But secondly, we also reduce the use of natural raw materials, especially limestone and others. The second, so that is a positive contribution on circular economy, because we could go for 100% recycling of all the concrete waste, if the conditions are met and all that, but that's for later. But secondly, we also can use in cement industry materials from other sectors, like steel industry, like the waste incinerators, like many other sectors, chemical industry. We can use that partly as waste, as waste from these sectors as fuel, but we also can use these materials as alternative raw materials in our production processes. So that symbiosis mentioned already by Judith is something that should be explored and should be intensified. Apart from that, the use of materials in the or reuse of materials in the building industry is for sure something that will come up. And then I add an additional component in this debate, but then it becomes complicated. Digitalization of materials, digitalization of products, and how they are produced and how they can be reused after a first phase of life, that is a very interesting prospect. Because if you have a concrete beam in a house, why should you not use, after that house is not used in the form as it is today, why should you not reuse that concrete beam in the same situation in the new building? It is possible, but you have to know what is in. What type of beam is it? How strong is it? What are the components? Now, all that thing, I personally believe completely in that digitalization. It is a challenge, but at the end, I have here classes. I am expecting that at certain moments, I will have a chip in these classes, saying exactly, this is this type of class, is produced there and there, the CO2 emission is there and there, and if you want to reuse, you can reuse it for new classes. Now, that is the way how I think we have to think about it. It's far beyond this discussion, but it will happen.
Yes, thank you, Rob. Adolfo, I'm afraid I need to stop us here because it's just, we have reached the time limit for this webinar. So many thanks for you participating in the roundtable discussion. We will, as far as we can, our colleagues respond in writing to some of the questions that have come in. I just want to remind all participants to this webinar that the full version of so the slides Oliver was presenting are available on our website. The paper they are based on is available on the website. In addition, an executive summary of a comprehensive technical report on the sector potentials for reducing emissions has been published today, and the full report of this more technical study will be published in January, also be available on our website. The recording of today's event will also be online in a couple of days' time. If you have any further questions that you want to ask in the follow-up to this webinar today, please direct them to webinar@agoraenergiewende.de, and we will make sure to follow up on that. If you want to be kept up to date on further events, publications, please register for our newsletter. You can do so on our website, and this will help you to stay in touch with what we're doing. So many thanks to all participants attending this webinar. Many, many thanks to our roundtable panelists, and also in retrospect again to Antoine and Jeremy that gave the first impulse statements this morning, and also many thanks to my colleagues Janne, Vido, Nicola and Oliver, who have enabled a really rich webinar this morning. So many thanks to, and enjoy wherever you are at the moment.